People often mistakenly believe that stripping away all material possessions can snap the very spine of a human being. They assume the loss of wealth equates to the loss of a soul. But they do not understand that when a tree is stripped bare of its leaves, that is precisely the moment its roots plunge deepest into the dark earth, reaching blindly, desperately for a great and silent underground spring. The air outside was a bitter 28 degrees Fahrenheit on that unforgiving March evening. Frost clung to the massive bay windows of the suburban estate, blurring the manicured lawns that stretched for 2 acres into the darkness. Inside, the grand mahogany dining table, a surface Vivian had polished by hand every Sunday for decades, felt as cold as a tombstone within the sprawling 6,000-square-foot house. She sat perfectly still. Vivian Whitmore, at 71 years old, possessed a face carved by quiet endurance. Her silver hair was pinned back immaculately, her posture rigidly upright despite the invisible weight crushing her chest. Across from her sat Nathaniel Vance, her husband of 46 years. He was 73, a brilliant structural engineer whose arrogance had only sharpened with age, much like the steel beams he spent his life designing. Beside him sat Gary Melton, a 50-year-old lawyer with slicked hair and a smile that resembled a razor blade. Between them lay a pristine stack of legal documents. "It is a straightforward dissolution, Vivian," stated Gary smoothly, his voice dripping with rehearsed condescension. "Given the prenuptial agreements you signed and the specific structuring of the estate, the financial divisions are already settled. The house, the investment portfolios, the offshore accounts, they all remain under Mr. Vance's sole ownership. They are classified as his separate property." Vivian did not blink. She absorbed the words as if they were physical blows, yet she refused to bleed. For 46 years, she had been the unseen foundation of Nathaniel's towering success. She had managed the household, hosted the lavish dinners for his affluent clients, scrubbed the grout, balanced the mundane checkbooks, and ironed the very shirts he wore to board meetings. She had willingly faded into the background, sacrificing her own youth and ambitions so he could build his empire. And now, through decades of calculated, dirty legal maneuvering, he had legally erased her existence from his ledger. "You have to understand, it is just business," Nathaniel muttered coldly, refusing to meet her eyes. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, a luxury she had picked out for him just 3 Christmases ago. "I need you out of the house by tonight. The new locks are being installed tomorrow morning." He was discarding her. Like a rusted tool that had outlived its usefulness, she was being thrown out into the freezing night. Gary tapped a heavy gold pen against the polished wood table, waiting for the hysterical sobbing, the screaming, the desperate pleading he was so accustomed to seeing from ruined spouses. He braced himself for the noise. It never came. Vivian simply rose from her chair. The silence in the dining room was deafening, heavy with a dignity that neither of the 2 men could comprehend. She looked at Gary for a brief, piercing second, then turned her unwavering gaze to Nathaniel. She looked straight into the eyes of the man who had just stolen half a century of her life. There was no hatred in her stare, only a profound, freezing pity for a soul so utterly hollowed out by greed. "Goodbye, Nathaniel," she whispered evenly. She turned on her heel and walked toward the grand staircase. Her footsteps were light, measured, echoing faintly against the vaulted ceilings. She entered the master bedroom, the space she had carefully decorated in soft creams and warm golds, and walked directly to her small, unassuming closet. She did not take the pearls. She did not take the expensive winter coats Nathaniel had bought her for public appearances. She reached for a faded canvas duffel bag.
With deliberate, steady hands, she folded 3 sets of worn, everyday clothes, faded denim jeans, thick cotton sweaters, and simple undergarments. She packed them away, smoothing out the wrinkles. Then she picked up her old, scuffed leather purse from the nightstand. She opened the brass clasp and looked inside. Nestled between a pack of mints and an old grocery receipt were a few crumpled bills, 110, 15, 2 singles, exactly $17. That was the entirety of her net worth after 46 years of loyal servitude. $17 and the clothes on her back. She closed the clasp with a soft, definitive click. She walked back down the stairs, past the oil paintings and the crystal chandeliers, past the life that was no longer hers. She did not glance toward the dining room. She did not pause at the luxurious entryway. She grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door, turned it, and stepped out into the biting cold of the Ohio night. The door clicked shut behind her. She was gone. The freezing wind immediately sliced through her thin cardigan, but Vivian merely tightened her grip on her purse and walked down the long paved driveway. Her old station wagon, a battered vehicle from the late 90s that Nathaniel had never bothered to upgrade, sat parked near the road. The engine groaned and sputtered in the frigid air before finally catching, the heater blowing out only a weak, lukewarm breath. She drove away without a single tear falling from her eyes. She navigated the dark, winding roads, driving 10 miles away from the affluent suburb until she reached a desolate, flickering street lamp at the edge of a deserted strip mall parking lot. She killed the engine. The silence of the night rushed into the cabin, thick and suffocating. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shivering legs as the temperature continued to drop. Sitting in the rusted shell of the station wagon, staring out into the pitch-black void with only 17 worthless dollars to her name, she felt the absolute bottom of the world pressing heavily against her shoulders. She was entirely alone. But as the freezing wind howled against the cracked windshield, Vivian had no idea that the ruthless cruelty of her husband had not just pushed her into the abyss, it had pushed her directly to a forgotten grave of the past, an ancient, moss-covered place holding a secret so powerful, so unimaginably heavy, that it was about to completely upend the untouchable order of the wicked.
The descent into absolute poverty is rarely a dramatic plunge. It is a slow, freezing erosion of human dignity. For 6 grueling weeks, the rusted shell of the station wagon became Vivian's entire universe. She slept curled tight against the vinyl seats, wrapping herself in a thin wool blanket as the night temperatures in Ohio regularly plummeted below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Every morning at dawn, she drove 3 miles to a dingy gas station, washing her weathered face and graying hair in a cracked porcelain sink under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. She did not weep. She simply adapted. Her joints ached with a deep, bone-chilling stiffness, and her weight dropped by 12 pounds, yet her spirit remained entirely intact. To survive, Vivian took a job cleaning floors and scrubbing grease at a small roadside diner owned by a 55-year-old woman named Sandra. Sandra offered her a cot in the back storage room, but Vivian politely declined the charity, accepting only leftover soup and stale bread as payment for her silent, relentless labor. It was during one particularly bleak night, parked beneath the solitary streetlight of a deserted gravel lot, that a gentle knock startled her. Vivian rolled down the frosted window exactly 2 inches. Outside stood Marcus Thorne, the 68-year-old night security guard who patrolled the grounds. He was a quiet man, a veteran whose own eyes held the heavy shadows of unspoken hardships. He did not offer empty pity. Instead, he reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled out a small, yellowed envelope. "My wife was given strict instructions to hold on to this," Marcus said softly, his voice rough from the cold. Your late mother, Eleanor, gave it to her a decade ago. She said it was only to be delivered if you ever found yourself with absolutely nothing left in this world. Vivian took the envelope with trembling fingers. Under the dim amber glow of the dome light, she carefully tore the brittle paper open. A heavy object slipped out, landing in the palm of her calloused hand. It was a thick, antique brass key, thoroughly crusted with decades of dark green rust. Folded neatly beside it was a single sheet of paper containing nothing but an address. It pointed to a heavily wooded, isolated acreage hidden deep within the dense Douglas firs of Blackwood County, nearly 40 miles away. She had to claim it. The very next morning, Vivian stood inside the brightly lit, sterile lobby of the Blackwood County zoning office. Her faded jeans were stained with grease, her boots were scuffed gray, and her hands were raw and blistered from weeks of manual labor. Across the wide mahogany counter, 3 well-dressed clerks exchanged amused, condescending whispers as they reviewed the coordinates of the property. "Ma'am, this parcel has been completely abandoned for over 40 years, the lead clerk sneered mockingly, tossing the deed file onto the counter. "It is nothing but an overgrown quarter-acre of weeds and a pile of rotting wood. You are wasting your time." Vivian did not flinch at the mockery. She looked calmly at the clerk, her posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. She reached into her scuffed leather purse, bypassed the lint in the old receipts, and pulled out her entire net worth. With slow, deliberate movements, she smoothed out the crumpled bills and placed them on the polished counter. 110, one single. "I will pay the $11 for the administrative transfer fee," she stated firmly. The clerk rolled his eyes, stamping the paper with a loud, dismissive thud. Vivian took the stamped deed, picked up her purse, and walked out into the pale morning sun. She drove her sputtering car up the winding, neglected dirt roads of Blackwood County, the tires crunching over fallen pine cones and thick layers of decaying pine needles. Finally, she stopped before a dense wall of towering Douglas firs. There, completely swallowed by wild, thorny vines and overgrown ferns, stood the cabin. It was a grim, desolate sight. The roof was sagging, the windows were caked in decades of grime, and the front porch looked ready to collapse under its own weight. To the rest of the world, it was an absolute eyesore. Vivian walked up the creaking wooden steps. She did not see ruin. She saw a quiet sanctuary that demanded nothing from her but honest sweat. She stood before the heavy oak door, gripped the rusted brass key, and slid it into the ancient iron lock. It caught for a brief second, stubbornly resisting, before turning with a heavy, satisfying metallic click. She pushed. Ignoring the sneers of the clerks and the bitter cruelty of the world she left behind, Vivian leaned her shoulder against the heavy wood, and as the door creaked open, the distinct scent of dry cedar and trapped thyme rushed over her, instantly awakening a sharp, inexplicable intuition in her mind.
The air inside the cabin was thick, suffocating and heavy with the undisturbed dust of 40 years, swirling lazily in the single shaft of pale afternoon light that managed to pierce the grime-caked front window. Cobwebs draped from the low ceiling like tattered gray funeral shrouds, catching the dried carcasses of moths and wasps, while a thick layer of raccoon droppings, dead pine needles, and crumbled white plaster covered the wide plank boards. To anyone else, the structure was nothing more than a hazardous ruin, a rotting wooden box destined for the bulldozer, a worthless, stinking eyesore that the civilized world had rightfully abandoned. Nathaniel would have scoffed at it. Her ex-husband, the great and wealthy structural engineer, would have stood on this sagging porch in his $3,000 suit, completely blind to anything that did not shine with cheap new money or brittle glass facades. He understood the cold, soulless mathematics of modern steel, but he possessed absolutely zero comprehension of the living spirit of a home. Vivian saw the truth.
She stood perfectly still in the center of the main room, her eyes slowly adjusting to the gloom, allowing her sharp, quiet intuition to strip away the decades of filth and decay to reveal the true architectural skeleton hiding beneath. She looked past the peeling floral wallpaper, the rusted tin cans scattered in the corners, and the nauseating smell of moldering dampness. She looked upward toward the vaulted roof. It was a breathtaking skeleton. Spanning the entire width of the ceiling were 6 massive solid white oak beams, each easily 12 inches thick and roughly 24 feet long, cut with an absolute uncompromising precision. They were joined by flawless wooden pegs, a masterclass in traditional timber framing that required no cheap iron nails to hold its tremendous crushing weight. The wood was dark, seasoned by time, hard as iron, and entirely untouched by termites or rot. She walked slowly toward the grand hearth that anchored the far end of the shadowy room. It was constructed of heavy, rough-hewn limestone blocks, standing 8 feet tall and built 3 feet deep, wide enough to roast a whole deer. She ran her blistered, calloused fingers over the freezing cold stone, feeling the undeniable strength, the sheer immovable permanence of the masonry. It had easily withstood 40 decades of harsh Ohio winters, enduring howling blizzards and plunging temperatures well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, without a single fraction of an inch of shifting or cracking in the mortar. It was invincible. Moving toward the cramped kitchen alcove, her hip brushed against a bulky rectangular object draped heavily beneath a rotting canvas tarp. With a swift, determined pull, the canvas tore away, releasing a massive cloud of choking gray dust into the stagnant air. Vivian coughed gently into the sleeve of her faded sweater, waving her hand to clear the space. When the dust finally settled, her eyes locked onto a long dining table made of pure, dark walnut. She traced the intricately carved edge of the heavy wood. Her fingertips found a familiar, subtle imperfection at the bottom right corner, a tiny, intentional groove shaped exactly like a crescent moon. Her breath hitched softly, catching in her dry throat as a wave of profound recognition washed over her. It was the signature mark of her late uncle, a master carpenter who had vanished from their lives over 30 years ago. He had crafted this beautiful piece with his own 2 hands. "I see you, Eleanor," she whispered softly. The realization hit her with the quiet force of an earthquake. This property was never a random purchase out in the wilderness. Her late mother, Eleanor, had not left her a temporary, pathetic shelter to merely survive the brutal storms of life. Decades ago, Eleanor had meticulously, quietly orchestrated the construction of an impenetrable family fortress, anticipating the exact moment her daughter would be thrown out to the wolves by a greedy, ruthless man. It was a silent, towering testament to a mother's eternal protective foresight. She was home. She inspected the kitchen area further, noting the heavy cast-iron wood stove in the corner. It was heavily oxidized, covered with a thick layer of bright orange rust, yet the heavy iron door swung open smoothly on its oiled hinges. It was a heavy-duty model, weighing at least 300 pounds, capable of heating the entire cabin through the bitterest freezing nights. She peered inside the deep firebox. It was completely free of ash, swept immaculately clean before the house was originally abandoned. Someone had prepared this house to sleep, not to die. She required no expensive contractors, no fancy electric tools, and certainly no arrogant engineers to tell her how to restore the dignity of this sacred space. She had spent 46 years silently maintaining a hollow, sprawling mansion for a man she despised, and now she would pour that exact same relentless, stoic energy into her own salvation. She grabbed a rusted bucket and a stiff-bristled broom from a dilapidated closet, preparing to wage war against the filth. as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the distant tree line, casting long, menacing shadows across the dusty pine floorboards. Vivian knelt beside the massive limestone fireplace to inspect the structural integrity of the north wall. She used a scrap of coarse, dry burlap to wipe away a thick, hardened layer of black soot and crystallized spider webs from the base of the grand hearth. Her hand suddenly stopped. The framework of the towering chimney was a brilliant masterpiece of masonry, a flawless, perfectly plumb interlocking puzzle of heavy stones. But her fingers traced the thick mortar lines just 6 inches above the floorboards. Her sharp eyes instantly locked onto a single rectangular block of limestone that was set exactly 2 inches deeper than the rest of the flat, uniform surface. It was an impossible error for a master craftsman, a glaring, deliberate setback in a wall of absolute perfection, a quiet invitation waiting patiently in the dark.
Dawn broke on the first day with a bitter frost that coated the towering Douglas firs in a sheath of blinding white ice, dropping the temperature to a brutal 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Vivian did not possess a heavy winter coat, nor did she have the luxury of a centralized heating system to warm her stiff, 71-year-old joints. She wore 3 layers of thin, faded cotton sweaters, wrapped her cracked hands in strips of torn burlap to prevent further bleeding, and walked outside to the old iron hand pump located 50 feet from the front porch. She primed the rusted pump. The physical labor began not with a grand, triumphant sweeping gesture, but with the brutal, humiliating, and agonizingly slow process of dragging a heavy tin bucket of freezing well water across the rotting front porch, over the threshold, and onto the filthy oak floorboards. She dropped to her knees. She did not utter a single word of complaint to the empty room, nor did she allow a single tear of self-pity to fall into the murky water as she dipped a stiff, bristled brush into the bucket and began to scrub away decades of accumulated grime, raccoon droppings, and caked mud. It was agonizing. Her shoulders burned with a deep, radiating fire, and her knuckles turned a mottled shade of blue and bruised purple as she worked her way across the vast expanse of the main room, moving inch by agonizing inch, scrubbing the thick oak planks until the original, rich, dark grain of the wood finally began to bleed through the gray filth. She worked for 14 straight hours that first day. She stopped only twice to drink from a cracked porcelain cup, chewing silently on a piece of stale bread she had saved from Sandra's diner, while the wind howled violently against the thin single-pane windows. Nathaniel would be laughing. He was likely sitting in his leather armchair right now, swirling a glass of $200 scotch, warming his perfectly manicured hands by the gas fireplace, while mocking the pathetic, destitute fate of the woman he had discarded like a piece of worthless trash. He believed she would shatter under the weight of manual labor. He believed that taking away her credit cards and her social standing would reduce her to a begging, weeping shell of a human being. He was entirely wrong. By the 4th morning, Vivian moved to the exterior of the cabin, facing a dense, terrifying jungle of thorny blackberry brambles and creeping ivy that had essentially swallowed the eastern wall of the structure, climbing 20 feet into the rotting eaves. She had no gardening gloves, no motorized trimmers, and no chemical sprays to conquer the overgrowth. She relied solely on her bare, blistered hands and a dull, rusted hand trowel she had unearthed from the muddy debris near the back door. She ripped the vines. She grabbed the thick, fibrous stalks of ivy, wrapping them tightly around her forearms, and leaned her entire body weight backward, using the leverage of her legs to tear the deep, stubborn roots straight out of the freezing, unforgiving earth. The thorns sliced viciously through the thin fabric of her jeans, leaving long, stinging scratches across her calves and thighs, drawing thin ribbons of bright crimson blood that quickly dried in the frigid air. She pulled away over 300 pounds of rotting vegetation over the course of 3 exhausting days. She cleared a path. The sheer stoicism of her daily routine,
The rhythmic, unending sounds of sweeping, chopping, and scrubbing, echoing through the quiet forest, soon began to attract the few scattered locals who occasionally drove their pickup trucks down the old logging road. They expected to see a crazy, broken old woman crying in the dirt. Instead, they saw a woman of immense quiet dignity, her silver hair tied back with a piece of twine, her jaw set with an iron determination as she systematically resurrected a dead house from the grave. On the evening of the 7th day, a rusted blue pickup truck slowly pulled into the cleared driveway, the tires crunching loudly against the fresh gravel Vivian had spent 6 hours hauling by hand from the creek bed a quarter of a mile away. The heavy door squealed open. Sandra stepped out into the freezing dusk, holding a massive, heavy bundle of fabric in her arms. The diner owner looked around the cleared yard, her eyes widening in absolute shock at the sheer volume of work that one elderly woman had accomplished, using nothing but her own 2 hands and sheer willpower. The rotting debris was gone, the windows were washed, the porch had been swept entirely clean. "I cannot believe my eyes," Sandra breathed softly, walking up the newly stabilized wooden steps. Vivian stood up from where she was pulling the final weeds near the foundation, wiping the dirt from her forehead with the back of her bruised hand. She offered a small, polite nod. "There is still a considerable amount of work to be done on the roof," Vivian replied calmly. Sandra shook her head, tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Vivian's bleeding, raw hands. She thrust the heavy bundle into Vivian's arms. It was a thick, handmade patchwork quilt, stuffed heavily with goose down, weighing easily 10 pounds and radiating a deep, comforting warmth. Tucked inside the folds of the quilt was a large thermos of hot chicken stew and a fresh loaf of sourdough bread. "You cannot sleep in this freezing cold without proper cover, Vivian," Sandra insisted warmly. "You are going to freeze to death out here. Please take this. It belonged to my grandmother, and she would have wanted a strong woman like you to have it." "Thank you, Sandra," Vivian said softly, as she accepted the heavy quilt, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tightness in her chest. For 46 years, she had lived in a mansion filled with thousands of expensive objects, yet she had never received a single gift that carried the profound, genuine warmth of this old, frayed blanket. The very next afternoon, another vehicle rumbled up the dirt path. It was Marcus, the quiet security guard who had delivered the original envelope. He parked his battered sedan near the tree line and walked slowly toward the porch, carrying a heavy, rusted steel toolbox that clanked loudly with every step he took. He set the box down heavily. "A house like this requires good steel to stand up straight," Marcus stated gruffly, opening the metal latch to reveal a treasure trove of well-oiled vintage tools. "There is a 30-inch iron crowbar in here, a heavy framing hammer, 2 pounds of galvanized nails, and a handsaw that still holds a wicked sharp edge. They're yours now." Vivian looked down at the heavy tools. They were not items of luxury, but weapons of survival. "I have no money to pay you for these," Vivian stated honestly, her voice steady and proud. Marcus smiled, a rare, genuine expression that crinkled the deep lines around his tired eyes. He looked at the perfectly scrubbed floors and the neatly stacked firewood she had gathered from the surrounding forest. "You have already paid for them with your sweat, ma'am," Marcus replied respectfully. "It is an honor to see someone fighting back instead of surrendering to the dark." With the heavy quilt keeping her warm at night and the iron tools accelerating her labor during the day, the cabin rapidly transformed from a rotting carcass into a modest, functioning home. By the 10th night, the temperature outside plummeted to a terrifying 12 degrees Fahrenheit. A brutal winter storm began to violently batter the region, the wind shrieking through the tops of the massive Douglas firs and hurling sharp pellets of ice against the newly cleaned window panes. Inside, however, the atmosphere was entirely different.
Vivian had successfully started a roaring fire inside the massive limestone hearth using the dry cedar logs she had chopped herself.
The bright golden flames cast a warm, dancing glow across the polished oak floorboards, pushing back the freezing darkness and filling the vast room with the comforting, heavy scent of wood smoke and old pine. She sat on a small wooden stool she had repaired, wrapping Sandra's heavy quilt tightly around her aching shoulders, listening to the violent storm raging outside the thick log walls. She was safe. She was exhausted, her muscles screaming with fatigue, her hands permanently scarred from the labor. Yet as she stared into the dancing flames, she felt an absolute, unshakable peace settling deep within her bones. She had survived the fall. She had hit the concrete bottom of the world and refused to shatter. But her work was not completely finished. As the fire burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, shifting shadows across the towering limestone chimney, Vivian's eyes drifted downward, locking once again onto that strange, recessed block of stone resting 6 inches above the floorboards on the north side of the hearth. For 10 days she had ignored it, focusing entirely on survival. But now, with the cabin secure and the storm raging outside, the mystery of the deliberate architectural flaw demanded her full attention. She stood up. She walked over to the heavy steel toolbox Marcus had given her, her fingers wrapping firmly around the cold, textured grip of the 30-inch solid iron crowbar. The tool weighed at least 8 pounds, a heavy, brutal instrument designed for maximum leverage and raw destruction. She carried it back to the hearth, kneeling on the hard floorboards directly in front of the recessed limestone block. It was time. She wedged the flattened, chisel-like end of the heavy iron crowbar into the thick mortar joint separating the recessed stone from the rest of the flawless wall. The mortar was incredibly old, yet it had not entirely petrified. It felt slightly softer, slightly more brittle than the rock-hard cement binding the surrounding blocks. Eleanor had left a vulnerability here, a calculated weakness meant specifically to be broken. Vivian took a deep breath. She pushed down on the heavy iron bar with both of her calloused hands, throwing her entire body weight onto the long lever. The iron bit deeply into the crack. The muscles in her arms trembled violently, her 71-year-old shoulders straining agonizingly against the immense, crushing weight of the solid limestone block. For a long, terrifying moment, absolutely nothing happened. The stone refused to yield, gripping its dark secret tightly, fighting against her desperate intrusion. She did not stop. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the sharp shooting pain radiating down her spine, and pushed down harder, throwing every single ounce of her remaining strength, every ounce of her anger, and every ounce of her quiet, burning dignity onto the cold steel bar. A sharp crack echoed loudly. The brittle mortar suddenly shattered into a dozen powdery gray fragments, spilling onto the floorboards in a cloud of thick white dust. The heavy rectangular block of limestone groaned loudly, shifting forward exactly 2 inches. Vivian quickly repositioned the iron crowbar, wedging it deeper into the widening gap, and pulled back with one final explosive burst of absolute desperate energy. The wall surrendered. By all her remaining strength, Vivian pried the heavy limestone block completely free, letting it crash heavily onto the solid oak floorboards with a deafening thud that shook the entire room. And from the deep, pitch-black void of the hidden alcove, an ancient, heavily oxidized tin box slowly slid into the firelight, carrying with it a bizarre, incredibly dense weight.
The heavy iron crowbar clattered loudly against the solid oak floorboards, rolling exactly 3 feet away before coming to a complete stop. Vivian did not immediately reach for the ancient, heavily oxidized tin box that had just emerged from the dark masonry void. She sat back on her heels.
The firelight flickered violently against the rusted metal surface, illuminating a thick, protective wrapping of oiled canvas that had miraculously shielded the container from 40 years of biting cold and creeping dampness. It was exceptionally heavy. She leaned forward, pressing her calloused, blistered fingers against the stiff canvas, slowly peeling back the rigid layers one by one until the bare tin was fully exposed. The lid was completely sealed shut by a thick, hardened layer of yellowish beeswax, a meticulous waterproofing technique used long before the invention of modern plastics. Vivian picked up her dull hand trowel, carefully chipping away the brittle wax along the entire perimeter of the rectangular lid. She lifted the rusted latch. The hinges emitted a sharp metallic screech that echoed through the vast, empty cabin, breaking a silence that had lasted for over 40 decades. As the heavy lid fell backward, a profound scent of dried lavender, aged parchment, and struck matches wafted up into the freezing air. There was no dust inside, no decay, and absolutely no sign of the ravages of time. It was perfectly preserved. Resting delicately on top of a bed of dry cedar shavings was a single thick parchment envelope, its edges slightly yellowed but otherwise immaculate. Written across the front in the elegant, sweeping cursive handwriting that Vivian had not seen since she was 50 years old were 5 simple words: "For my daughter, in winter." Vivian felt a sudden sharp tightening in her chest, a physical ache that was entirely separate from the brutal manual labor she had endured. She broke the wax seal. "My dearest Vivian," she read silently, her eyes tracing the steady, unwavering ink of her late mother, Eleanor. "If your hands are holding this letter, it means my greatest fear has come to pass, and that ruthless, hollow man has finally discarded you. I saw the pure greed rotting inside Nathaniel a decade ago, long before he began hiding his assets and manipulating those wicked marital contracts. But I also knew your stoic heart would never abandon a vow you made before God." The truth was staggering. The letter continued, detailing a brilliant, entirely silent counteroffensive that Eleanor waged against the arrogant structural engineer while she was still alive. She knew Nathaniel would eventually use his slick lawyers to siphon the bank accounts, claim the massive suburban estate, and leave Vivian destitute on the street. Therefore, Eleanor secretly liquidated the vast, untraceable core of her own ancestral estate, channeling every single dollar away from the banking system and hiding it where no subpoena could ever reach. "This cabin is not a place for you to hide and lick your wounds," the letter concluded, the final words striking Vivian with the force of a physical blow. "It is a fortress built to launch your second life. You are not starting over from nothing, my quiet girl. You are starting over from a foundation of absolute, unyielding iron. Do not weep for the trash that threw you away." She lowered the paper. There were no hysterical tears, no dramatic wails of sorrow echoing against the limestone hearth, only a profound, vibrating silence as a supreme sense of elevation washed over her entirely. She reached deeper into the rusted tin box, pulling out 3 heavy, dark blue velvet pouches that clinked with a dense, unmistakable resonance. She untied the thick leather drawstring of the largest pouch, tipping it gently over her open palm. A cascade of heavy metal tumbled out. They were perfectly round, brilliant, and completely untarnished, catching the orange firelight and reflecting it back with a blinding, mesmerizing intensity. Vivian spread them across the rough floorboards, her trembling fingers counting exactly 50 minted gold coins from the late 19th century. Each coin was a flawless, uncirculated masterpiece of solid gold, completely untraceable, completely tax-exempt, and carrying a numismatic value that dwarfed the actual weight of the precious metal. But the gold was only the beginning. Beneath the velvet pouches lay thick, heavy stacks of crisp, beautifully engraved paper, bound tightly by rotting rubber bands that immediately snapped when touched. She unfolded the top document, her eyes scanning the ornate formal typography printed across the top margin. They were bearer bonds issued by industrial titans in the early 1920s, financial instruments that belonged entirely, legally, and unquestioningly to whoever physically held them in their hands. They were worth a fortune. For decades, they had sat completely silent in the pitch-black void of the masonry wall, immune to market crashes, immune to divorce decrees, and violently compounding in interest with every passing year. Nathaniel and his ruthless lawyer had spent years fighting for the scraps of the modern estate, entirely blind to the immense, crushing generational wealth that Eleanor had buried directly beneath this rotting pine floor. She gathered the treasure. Vivian carefully placed the 50 gold coins back into their velvet pouches, stacked the 100-year-old bearer bonds with meticulous precision, and returned the protective letter to its envelope. She possessed no anger towards her ex-husband in that moment, only a towering, icy superiority that comes from holding a royal flush in the absolute dark. She wrapped the heavy tin box back into its oiled canvas, preparing for the long drive to the city at dawn. The letter had indeed provided her with an invisible, invincible armor, but the true, staggering financial weight of these 19th-century coins and ancient corporate bonds was so massive, so completely absurd in its scale, that even a hardened, stoic legal veteran would find his hands violently shaking when he finally lowered his jeweler's magnifying glass.
The drive into the town square of Blackwood County took exactly 45 minutes, the rusted station wagon rattling over the uneven asphalt until it parked outside a modest red brick building. Vivian walked up the short flight of wooden stairs, her boots still caked in dried mud, carrying the heavy canvas-wrapped box tightly against her chest. She entered the quiet, unassuming office of Howard Gale, a 75-year-old rural attorney whose reputation for absolute, unbending integrity was legendary among the locals. He was waiting for her. Howard did not ask about her faded clothes, the deep scratches on her arms, or the exhausted hollows beneath her eyes, but simply gestured for her to sit in the worn leather chair across from his massive oak desk. Without a single word, Vivian placed the heavy tin box onto the polished wood, pushing it slowly across the surface until it rested precisely between them. She unwrapped the oiled canvas. He opened the lid. For the next 4 hours, the small office was transformed into a silent, meticulous laboratory, occupied by Howard, a summoned financial auditor, and a trusted numismatic expert who had driven 80 miles from the city just to verify the contents of the rusted tin. The room was absolutely devoid of noise, save for the soft rustling of brittle parchment, the quiet clinking of solid gold against the glass table, and the rhythmic clicking of a heavy mechanical calculator. Nobody spoke a single word. The appraiser adjusted his thick jeweler's loop, holding each of the 50 19th-century gold coins up to the harsh fluorescent light, verifying the mint marks, the exact weight in ounces, and the flawless, uncirculated condition that made them incredibly rare. Across the room, the financial auditor meticulously cataloged the stacks of bearer bonds, cross-referencing the issuing corporations, calculating the staggering, terrifying weight of nearly a century of unbroken, compounding interest. Finally, Howard took off his glasses. "Vivian," he stated quietly, his weathered hands actually trembling as he placed a single sheet of paper down on the desk. The total valuation of the physical gold, combined with the liquid yield of the mature bearer bonds, brings the entire estate to a shocking number: $2,800,000.
She did not gasp. She simply sat there, absorbing the astronomical figure with the exact same stoic, unwavering composure she had shown when she was thrown out into the freezing night with absolutely nothing. From a discarded, ruined woman clutching a pathetic $17 in a freezing car, she had just been elevated to a legally untouchable millionaire, possessing a staggering fortune completely free of debt, mortgages, or marital claims. "There is more," Howard added warmly. He opened a heavy iron safe located behind his desk, withdrawing a thick, blue-bound legal folio that bore the signature of her late mother, Eleanor. He placed it carefully beside the valuation sheet. "This is an irrevocable trust established 3 years before your mother passed away. The property, the cabin, and every single asset contained within that box were placed directly into this trust. You are the absolute sole beneficiary." It was a perfect shield. Nathaniel Vance has absolutely zero legal standing, zero community property claims, and zero power to contest this, Howard continued calmly, his eyes reflecting a deep, satisfying justice. The wicked, greedy structural engineer had spent decades building his fragile, arrogant empire of glass and debt, entirely unaware that his quiet, subservient wife now held a fortress of solid gold and impenetrable legal armor. Vivian nodded slowly, extending her calloused, blistered hand to sign the documents that officially transferred the immense power of the trust into her own name. She thanked the elderly lawyer, picked up her heavy box, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, feeling the undeniable gravitational pull of her new reality. She was finally free. But a fortune of $2,800,000 is a massive, blinding beacon in a small county, and it took less than 48 hours for the quiet whispers of the massive local bank transfer to snake their way across the state lines, bypassing the thick forests entirely. The news of the massive fortune immediately reached the ears of the betrayer, and the sweet, intoxicating scent of money caused her ex-husband to rush toward the cabin with the most vile, desperate legal scheme imaginable.
Nathaniel Vance was losing everything. His massive, over-leveraged commercial real estate investments, built entirely on a fragile foundation of aggressive bank loans, deceptive accounting practices, and immense corporate greed, were suddenly facing total, catastrophic bankruptcy. The arrogant structural engineer who had spent 46 years treating his stoic wife as an unpaid servant had suddenly caught the unmistakable, intoxicating scent of $2,800,000. The massive financial wire transfer executed by the rural attorney had triggered automated alerts across various banking networks, eventually reaching the desperate, feral ears of his lawyer, Gary Melton. They drove aggressively. Their sleek, heavy luxury sedan violently bounced over the deep ruts of the dirt road, tearing through miles of dense Douglas firs, scraping its expensive undercarriage against jagged rocks until it violently skidded to a halt in front of the restored cabin. Nathaniel stepped out into the freezing afternoon air, his expensive wool coat flapping in the bitter wind, his face twisted into a pathetic mask of fake, rehearsed affection that entirely failed to hide the wild, desperate panic burning brightly in his eyes. He walked up the porch. He fully expected to find a ruined, weeping woman cowering in the filth, desperate for a few crumbs of his attention and willing to surrender her newfound wealth just to hear him apologize. But the cabin before him was no longer a rotting grave. It was a fortress of perfectly scrubbed oak, fortified limestone, and quiet, unyielding dignity. He pushed open the heavy front door without knocking, stepping into the warm, cedar-scented room alongside Gary, his slick-haired lawyer carrying a heavy leather briefcase filled with malicious, threatening legal drafts designed to crush her spirit. Vivian did not stand up. She sat perfectly still on a beautifully restored, solid walnut chair near the massive stone hearth, her calloused, blistered hands wrapped gently around a steaming porcelain cup of herbal tea. She wore her faded denim jeans and a simple cotton sweater, radiating an absolute, chilling calmness that immediately made the two invading men look incredibly small, incredibly pathetic, and entirely out of place in her domain. "Vivian, my dear," Nathaniel began smoothly, his voice dripping with a nauseating manufactured warmth as he took a confident step forward. "I have been so terribly worried about you out here in the freezing woods, and I simply had to come see if you were surviving the cold." She took a sip. She did not offer him a seat, she did not offer him a polite greeting, and she certainly did not believe a single poisonous syllable falling from his lying mouth. When the fake affection met a wall of absolute, impenetrable silence, the mask instantly slipped, revealing the ruthless, greedy coward hiding beneath the expensive clothes. "Let us drop the act, Vivian," Nathaniel snapped coldly, his face flushing a deep, angry red as he looked straight at Vivian. "I know exactly what you found hidden in these walls, and you are entirely delusional if you think you can simply walk away with $2,800,000 while I suffer a financial crisis." Gary stepped forward quickly. "Under the specific statutes of marital law, any hidden assets discovered during the immediate dissolution period are legally considered joint property," Gary stated aggressively, pulling a thick stack of papers from his briefcase and waving them in the air. "We are fully prepared to drag you through years of brutal, exhausting litigation, freeze every single bank account you hold, and take this miserable cabin from you unless you immediately sign over exactly half of the estate." It was a pathetic threat. For 46 years, Nathaniel had relied heavily on intimidation, financial abuse, and loud, aggressive posturing to force her into silent submission, expecting her to immediately crumble under the sheer weight of his booming voice. He waited for the tears, the trembling apologies, the desperate pleas for mercy, assuming she was still the terrified woman he had kicked out of his mansion. Vivian placed her cup down. She looked directly into the eyes of the man who had abandoned her with $17, her face an unreadable, stoic mask of quiet superiority. "You own nothing here," she stated evenly. Before Nathaniel could unleash another furious, screaming tirade, the heavy wooden door of the back bedroom slowly creaked open, and Howard Gale, the 75-year-old rural attorney, stepped quietly into the main room. He wore a simple, unpretentious tweed suit, but his presence carried the immense, crushing weight of absolute legal destruction. He dropped a heavy folio on the walnut table. "Mr. Vance, you are currently trespassing on private property that is entirely governed by an irrevocable trust. This specific trust was established 3 years prior to your divorce, entirely funded by generational assets that were never commingled with your fraudulent, collapsing marital accounts." Nathaniel sneered loudly. "I will sue this pathetic trust into the ground," Nathaniel spat furiously, his fists clenching tightly at his sides as he glared at the old man. Howard did not flinch. He calmly opened the thick blue-bound folio, pointing a weathered, steady finger directly at a specific, heavily bolded paragraph located near the bottom of the page. "You will do absolutely no such thing," Howard countered sharply. "This document contains an ironclad, absolute no contest clause, meaning any legal attempt to challenge the beneficiary will instantly result in the immediate forfeiture of any standing, and furthermore, you have zero standing to begin with." The lawyer paused, allowing the heavy silence to stretch. "But more importantly, Mr. Vance," Howard continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous, freezing whisper, "by auditing the historical tax records to verify the absolute separation of these funds, my team discovered the extensive, highly illegal offshore accounts you and Mr. Melton have been actively using to hide your commercial assets from the federal government over the past 10 years. The room went dead. Gary dropped his leather briefcase. It hit the floorboards with a loud, heavy thud, the slick lawyer taking a sudden, terrified step backward as the horrific reality of the situation finally pierced his arrogant skull. If you ever set foot within 10 miles of this property, or if you ever attempt to contact my client for a single penny, I will immediately forward the entire unredacted dossier of your financial fraud directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. They will seize your properties, they will revoke your licenses, and they will put you both in federal prison for a very long time." Nathaniel stopped breathing. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray as the towering, arrogant empire he had spent decades building instantly collapsed under the crushing, undeniable weight of absolute truth. He looked at the heavy legal documents, he looked at the stern, unyielding face of the rural attorney, and finally, he looked at Vivian. She simply watched him drown. There was no mercy in her eyes, no lingering affection, only the cold, hard justice of a woman who had survived the absolute worst he could inflict and had emerged utterly invincible. Nathaniel Vance, the brilliant structural engineer, the man who had mercilessly thrown his wife into the freezing night without a second thought, was completely broken. His shoulders slumped forward in profound, humiliating defeat, his hands trembling violently as the total destruction of his reputation, his wealth, and his freedom stared him in the face. He turned around. He dragged his feet heavily across the oak floorboards, shuffling past his terrified lawyer, and walked out the door without uttering a single word of defense. He climbed into his expensive car, a ruined, hollow shell of a man, the tires spinning desperately in the gravel as he fled into the long shadows of the late afternoon. Karma had arrived. The venomous invaders were permanently banished from her sight in absolute, total humiliation, returning the profound, unbroken silence to the ancient cedar forest, a quiet sanctuary where Vivian now sat, entirely undisturbed, patiently waiting to welcome the most brilliant, breathtaking dawn after surviving half a century completely trapped in the suffocating dark.
With a fortune of $2,800,000 sitting securely within an impenetrable legal trust, Vivian Whitmore did not return to the affluent, suffocating suburbs. She did not purchase a sprawling, modern estate. She did not hire a staff of silent servants, and she did not wrap herself in expensive silk or useless diamonds. She remained in the quiet, breathing forest. She bought seeds. She took the desolate, abandoned acreage that had cost her exactly $11 in administrative fees and slowly transformed the surrounding earth into a sprawling, vibrant farm. Rows of fragrant lavender, healing chamomile, and resilient rosemary stretched for hundreds of yards across the sunlit property, their roots digging deeply into the rich, dark soil. The heavy limestone cabin remained her simple, steadfast sanctuary, but the surrounding land was no longer isolated. She opened the doors. Over the following months, the restored wooden fortress became a quiet, fiercely protected refuge for women who had been financially decimated, legally deceived, or emotionally broken by ruthless partners. They arrived with nothing but faded suitcases and shattered confidence, seeking shelter from the brutal storms of their own tragic lives. Vivian offered them honest labor in the dirt, the comforting heat of the heavy ironwood stove, and the quiet dignity of rebuilding a life from absolute zero. They worked the soil together, pulling weeds with their bare hands, turning their shared grief into undeniable strength. They learned to stand. Now, at 72 years old, Vivian sat peacefully on the sweeping front porch as a breathtaking golden sunset began to wash over the tops of the massive Douglas firs. The bitter, freezing temperatures of the previous winter were entirely gone, replaced by a gentle evening breeze that carried the sweet, heavy scent of blooming herbs across the sprawling acreage. The temperature was a mild 70 degrees Fahrenheit, wrapping the forest in a comfortable, soothing blanket of twilight. She rested comfortably in a heavy rocking chair crafted from solid cedar. The air was perfectly still.
Resting warmly against her worn denim jeans was a small, scruffy terrier mix she had adopted from a local shelter just 3 weeks prior. The dog weighed barely 15 pounds, a once discarded, frightened creature that had finally found an immovable protector. Vivian gently stroked the soft fur behind the ears of the sleeping animal, her calloused, permanently scarred hands moving with a slow, rhythmic grace. She had finally won. The bright golden light of the fading sun illuminated the deep, beautiful lines carved into her serene face, highlighting a quiet, eternal freedom that no amount of dirty money could ever purchase. There was absolutely no lingering anger toward her ex-husband, no burning desire for petty revenge, and no dark shadows of the past haunting her disciplined mind. The hollow, pathetic world of Nathaniel Vance had completely evaporated into nothingness, leaving behind only an ocean of priceless, unshakable peace. She did not miss the sprawling suburban mansion, nor did she miss the fragile, glass-walled life she had been forced to leave behind. She closed her eyes. Sitting on the porch of the magnificent wooden fortress, miles away from the venomous greed of the city, she inhaled the crisp, clean air of her own glorious creation. From a miserable $17 and the coldest betrayal a human heart could ever endure, this ancient log cabin had resurrected itself to clearly prove a profound, undeniable truth to the universe. Never determine your ultimate value based on how a broken, selfish person decides to treat you. Because sometimes losing the entirety of a fake, manufactured world is simply the very first, brutally necessary step you must take to finally unlock a magnificent, untouchable kingdom of your very own.